One of the worst pieces of advice that I see people giving to sock knitters on a regular basis is that if you know your cast on number, you'll be able to knit a sock that fits. That might be true in some circumstances, but it's not universally true. And in fact, there are scenarios where that will virtually guarantee that you are knitting a sock that does not fit you. If we haven't met yet, hi, I'm Lauren. I design knitting patterns with a special focus on socks. So I have very strong feelings about this particular topic because I have seen so many sock knitters get frustrated by trying a new pattern and doing their normal cast on number and finding that the sock doesn't fit them at the end. In today's video, we're going to talk about the factors that affect the fit of your sock, how you want your sock to fit, and how to make sure that your sock fits every time. So first, let's talk about why knowing your cast on stitch number is not enough to guarantee a well-fitting sock. And to do that, I have brought some visual aids. These two socks were knit with the exact same yarn, on the exact same needles, using the exact same cast on number. These are both knit with Magpie Fibers Swanky Sock. This one is knit with a bunch of scraps from other projects. This one is one of the projects that gave me some scraps for this sock. Now what you'll notice is this one is a vanilla sock. It's got some stripes on it, but there's no texture. This one, on the other hand, is heavily cabled. Those are all 2/1/2 cables going all up and down the width of that sock. This is my gladdening socks. I love this pattern. What you'll notice when I lay them over each other is that even though I have the same cast on number, the same needles, and the same yarn, look, that's lined up perfectly on the edge there, that stockinette sock is significantly larger. And that's one of the most significant things that is going to affect the texture of your sock. If you're only ever knitting vanilla socks, you're probably mostly okay doing just your normal cast on number. We'll come back to that in a little bit. If, however, you start incorporating texture into your socks, you may find that you are running into a little bit of trouble, especially if there's a lot of cabling in the sock, because what cabling does is it draws the fabric in and across each other, right? The stitches are crossing each other, and so that tightens down the fabric. Now, when I finish my socks, I always block them out to size. So in the end, they block out to the same size, but that doesn't mean that they have the same amount of stretch in them. So the cables will reduce the amount of stretch in your sock. If you are used to knitting your socks so that they are fairly snug already, and you rely pretty heavily on stockinette's ability to stretch over your feet, look how stretchy that is. Stockinette is an extraordinarily stretchy fabric. If you primarily knit vanilla socks and you rely on that stockinette stretchiness to ensure that you get a good fit, and then you transition over to a cabled sock where you have much less stretch, you may find that the sock you finish, even though it's the same yarn you always use, the same needles you always use, and the same cast on number you always use, that sock is not going to fit. Another factor that might affect the fit of your socks, even if you are still doing vanilla socks, is the actual yarn that you choose, because there is a range of thickness within the labeling of fingering weight yarn or sock yarn, which is what we most commonly use for knitting socks. So the most common way to determine a yarn's thickness is by looking at its wraps per inch, or its WPI. You can see here, I have wrapped some yarn snugly, but not tightly, around this crochet hook. And then if I were curious about whether this was a fingering weight yarn or a sport weight yarn, I would take a measuring tape or a ruler and I would measure 1 inch, and I would see how many wraps there are on that crochet hook per inch. Now, fingering weight yarn has a pretty significant range there. It can be anywhere from 14 to 22 wraps per inch. That's a big difference. So if you normally use a really fine sock yarn and you decide to try a new yarn and that yarn is more of a thicker sock yarn, you may actually find that the sock you finish knitting is bigger. I often see conversations in knitting groups where people ask, what is a really good budget-friendly sock yarn? And I see a lot of people recommending Patton's Croy sock yarn, which I agree is a good yarn. It's very durable. It's quite squishy. I like it a lot. The thing is, it is thicker than most sock yarns. And so when I knit socks using that yarn, I usually go down a few in my cast on number for those socks, even if I'm just doing a plain vanilla sock, because I know that thicker yarn is going to end up giving me a slightly larger sock. And finally, your personal gauge as a knitter can change depending on circumstances and over time. So when I'm in a period of life where I'm really stressed out, my gauge is tighter. And when I'm very relaxed, my gauge is a little bit looser. My gauge back when I was a practicing lawyer was very, 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 very tight. I used to bend metal sock needles. That's how tight my gauge was. Now, my gauge is a little bit looser. What does that mean for you as a sock knitter? That means you need to know more than just, I usually cast on 64 stitches to knit a sock. Okay, before we get into how exactly to make sure you knit a sock that fits every time, we need to talk about what a good sock fit is. For most people, not everybody, but for most people, you are going to want a sock that has about 1 to 2 inches of negative ease. That means that the sock circumference is 1 to 2 inches smaller than the foot the sock is going to go on. Let's say, for example, your foot has an 8-inch circumference. You're going to want a sock that measures probably 6 to 7 inches, depending on how snug you like your socks and how much give, how much stretch there is in that sock, right? So for this one, I might want just like 1 inch of negative ease because this one doesn't have much stretch on it. This one, I could go for a little more negative ease if I wanted to because this has much more stretch. For the length of your sock, you also want just a little bit of negative ease because if you've ever worn a sock that's kind of loose and floppy in the toe, that's not a good feeling. Now, why do we want that negative ease in our socks, both lengthwise and widthwise? It's a matter of making the sock stay put when you wear it. If you've ever worn an ill-fitting sock, you have probably experienced one of these things. The sock drooping down inside the sock, maybe even sliding under your heel a little bit. The sock bunching up at the toe, especially if the sock is a little too long for you. Or my personal least favorite, and this will also be affected by your gait, the sock spiraling around your foot. That one's most common if you have a gait where you tend to overpronate or underpronate, right? Where you're landing on the outside of your foot or the inside of your foot. I never remember which of those is over and which is under, but you get the picture. So having a sock that fits well is not just a matter of comfort, it's also a matter of function. A sock that is too tight across your feet is going to be more likely to develop holes and wear spots more quickly and easily because the fabric is already under stress from being stretched too much on your feet. So let's say you are planning to cast on a sock this afternoon and you want to make sure that it is going to fit you perfectly. What do? There are a couple tools you're going to need. One is you're going to need your foot. I'm not showing you my foot in this video because this is not that kind of channel. I'm going to be using a stand-in for my foot, which is going to be this sock on a sock blocker, okay? And you're going to need a measuring tape of some sort, and you're going to need a pen or a pencil, some sort of writing implement, and something to write down some notes on. So the first thing you want to do is you want to measure your foot at the widest point of the foot. For most of us, this is going to be the ball of the foot. Now, the ball of the foot is not this part down here under your heel, even though that makes the most sense because that's the part of your foot shaped most like a ball, right? That's not the ball of your foot. That's the underside of your heel. The ball of your foot is this fleshy part on the sole right below where your toes meet your feet. So you're going to measure there. And you're going to take your tape measure and you're going to wrap it around the ball of your foot. You're going to start here, wrap it all the way around the ball of your foot, and figure out what that measurement is. So for this sock, if this sock were an actual foot, the foot would be 7 inches in circumference. Now, this sock is knit and blocked for my feet, which are 8 inches in circumference. So I've got the perfect negative ease, which is just what I want. Once you know the circumference of your foot, you need to know your gauge with the yarn you plan to use and the needles you plan to use. There are a couple ways to do this. One of these methods is just to knit a simple, straightforward gauge swatch. You already have a sock that's going to be maybe 7 to 9 inches in circumference. The gauge swatch is 4 inches. So you can knit the gauge swatch and that'll give you a pretty good sense of what your gauge is going to be like for your sock. Another thing a lot of knitters like to do is they will knit part of the leg of the sock, which is usually in most patterns the same circumference as the circumference of the foot of the sock. And then once they get a few inches into the leg of the sock, they will pause and they will block that part of the sock that they have knit and then see what that gauge is. Now again, I need to pause and make something very, very, very clear here. When I say block your gauge swatch, I do not mean that you have to put it on a sock blocker. That is not necessary. And in fact, for some knitters, a sock blocker is going to shape the sock to a shape that doesn't fit them well. When I say you need to block your gauge swatch, I mean that you need to give it a soak in lukewarm water, gently squeeze it out, and lay it flat to dry. Why do I recommend that? Because you are going to need to wash your socks at some point. You cannot knit socks and then never wash them. That's gross. And because the vast majority of socks are knit with natural fibers, those fibers are going to change when they interact with water. Wool in particular, especially the superwash wool that is so common with sock yarns, tends to stretch when it comes into contact with water. So your unblocked gauge swatch may not be anywhere close to your finished final gauge. And if your sock is eventually going to get wet, because you have to wash it, your sock is eventually going to expand out to the size of the blocked gauge swatch. So use your blocked gauge swatch. Again, not blocked on a sock blocker. That's not necessary. Soak in lukewarm water, gently squeeze out the water, lay flat to dry, and then take your measurements. Now, the most important gauge measurement you are going to need for your socks is your row gauge. That is how many stitches per inch you have going around. That's because that'll tell you whether you have enough stitches when you cast on to match the circumference that you need. For example, let's say you want to knit a 7-inch sock And with the yarn you're using and the needles you're using, you get 8 stitches per inch, and you cast on 64 stitches. Is that going to get you a 7-inch sock circumference? Absolutely not. You need to go down to 56 stitches, my friend. When you start using sock patterns that have texture in the legs, they will generally give you a gauge indication, the gauge that the designer used for the sock design. And then the pattern will generally tell you what the finished dimension is as well. So if the sock designer is working at a gauge of 9 stitches per inch and you prefer to work at a gauge of 7 stitches per inch, you will have the information that you need to know whether you need to choose a larger size than usual or a smaller size than usual and adjust upward or downward. Now, if you're working from a very old sock pattern or from a newer pattern written by somebody who learned from the older sock patterns, you might see instructions that say to go up a size, go up a needle size, and to go down a size, go down a needle size. This is bad advice. Don't do that. Going up or down a needle size doesn't necessarily affect your stitch gauge and row gauge in the same way, and it doesn't create the same stitch density for each of the different pattern sizes. So if you knit a larger size, your sock is going to be looser and is therefore going to be more likely to wear out quickly. If you knit a smaller size, your sock is going to be tighter and it might be uncomfortable because there are so many stitches per inch. My approach as a sock pattern designer is to grade my pattern for several sizes. So I grade all of my patterns now for 5 sizes, from slightly smaller than the smallest women's size recommended by the Craft Yarn Council. That's for my friends with narrower feet. All the way up to the largest men's size recommended by the Craft Yarn Council for my friends with larger feet. Now, I don't distinguish between men's and women's sizing in my patterns for several reasons. One is I have had friends who are cis women who are very tall and have very large feet. I have friends who are trans women who have larger feet and who still want to knit beautiful, pretty things. And frankly, cis men deserve to get to wear pretty, frilly things too. So I don't distinguish between men's and women's sizing. Instead, in my patterns, they say sizes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then they say, here's the circumference for each of those sizes. And then you pick the circumference that matches your foot. All right, so that takes care of the foot circumference, which is the most important information when making sure that the sock you are knitting is going to fit you. But what about the length of your sock? What about that? That's where you need your row gauge. Row gauge is how many stitches you have going this way, right? How many rows in a vertical inch of your swatch. The designer should also tell you what their row gauge is along with their stitch gauge. And so you can know, okay, if I'm getting fewer rows per inch, then I'm probably going to need a little more yarn than the designer estimates. And I might need to work a few more repeats in the foot to reach the length that I want. Now, again, different designers will handle this differently. In my patterns, I use a very open-ended foot length instruction. And so I say, once you finish knitting the gusset on the sock, knit the foot as long as you need to until it is 2 inches shorter than you need it to be. And then we start working on the toe. That gives you a lot of flexibility. Other sock designers will design for a specific foot length in mind. And so they'll say, work 4 more repeats of the stitch pattern and then start working on the toe. That's when it can be really helpful to know your row gauge, because if your row gauge is tighter than the designers or looser than the designers, you may want to work more repeats or fewer repeats than they did in their sample of the sock pattern. Knowing the actual circumference of your foot and the circumference of the sock that you need to knit for it to fit well can be helpful in more than just this context, because what if you want to knit a sock with thicker yarn? Patterns using sport weight, DK weight, and worsted weight yarn are becoming more and more popular, but they use different thickness of yarn and they use different size needles. So your normal cast on number is going to be useless. Now, as you become a more experienced sock knitter, you will not need to do this every time because your gauge will stay relatively consistent within a relative range of yarn, right? So if I'm knitting with a yarn that has 410 yards per 100 grams, and I usually use a yarn that has 400 yards per 100 grams, that's going to be a tiny bit thicker, but not thick enough to really throw things off. If I'm using the same needles and I am working a stitch pattern that I know that my gauge in, that's going to be fine. I'm not going to need to go through the whole measuring and swatching process again. But if you are using a new yarn that is significantly different from the yarn you usually use, if you are switching needle materials, for example, if you usually work in wood and now you're switching to metal, or if you are using a new texture in the sock pattern, I would really recommend going through the process of swatching, blocking, and measuring your swatch once it dries. Once you know how to do this, you will never be in the position of having to email a designer and say, I normally cast on 64 stitches for my socks, but the sock pattern I just bought from you doesn't have a size of 64 stitches. What do I do? you'll know what to do. You'll be able to do the math, you'll be able to do the swatching, and you'll be able to figure out which size you think is going to be a better fit for you. All right, that's it for today. If you have any questions about making sure that your socks fit better, please do feel free to drop questions down in the comments below. If there are enough questions, I can always do a follow-up episode. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer in the comments if I'm able to. You can also find more information, tons more information about sock knitting over on my blog if you like consuming information in a written format as well, and I will link that down in the description. Otherwise, thanks for being here, and I look forward to seeing you next time.